in China and the Managing Director of PGA Tour China. In this webinar, we will examine the impact of the coronavirus on the business environment, the Chinese economy, and what we can expect to see in the months to come. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, and we will try our best to answer everyone's question at the very end during our Q&A session. We will also be sharing a survey to get your feedback on today's webinar, so please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. And finally, I would like to remind everyone to follow our social media accounts for more research, data, and other content related to the Chinese economy. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Dr. Li Wei, who will present China's economic outlook and reveal for the very first time the results of its March 2020 BCI survey. Dr. Li Wei.
Thank you, Jessica. Let me first bring out my, let's see. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for participating in this webinar. And what I would be doing is I'm going to show you a PowerPoint, and that would include the data Jessica just mentioned about the BCI index that we collected for these months. And so I'm going to do share screen, and all right. Okay, and I'm going to. Okay, so my talk is going to focus primarily on the Chinese private sector, and we'll talk about a little bit about other implications as well. So let's dive right into it. The coronavirus causes a disease we now call the COVID-19. It is really attack humans at our heart, right? It's because what we, as modern human, we live a life, and it's a fact of our life that we depend and thrive on social interaction. Somehow this virus and all kinds of viruses learned that the best way to survive is to ride on that, right? And that so they adapt very well to our modes of living, and we are, as a result, impacted very severely by that. This is maybe a once-in-a-lifetime event, and I think we are sort of comparing it to perhaps with the 1918 Spanish flu, which had caused a much greater number of deaths, which run through the world in 3 waves, and it's really wrecked the economy. But because the global economy was not as globalized and as today, so the GDP decline was about 6% from that 3 waves of virus. But this time around, I think it is very different, and I think we are looking at perhaps a much lower death rate, death load, but a much higher impact on the economy. Currently, there are over 500,000 diagnosed with the disease worldwide, and close to 23,000 killed. And many governments has implemented mitigation strategies aimed at containing this virus. And those strategies led to 1/3 of the world population on lockdown. And these, I would remind you that 1/3 of the world population are primarily located in economic centers around the world. So this is quite a large impact on the economy. And there are 90% students out of school. So this is part of that so social distancing that we are practicing. As we realize from the Chinese experience, more dramatic strategies save more life, but they also incur higher economic costs, as we will see in the in our data going forward. Basically, we're observing is that the economy cratered. We're looking at the first quarter decline. The official data has been out. We probably looking at first quarter decline on the order of double digits in the Chinese economy. Many policies have been implemented, in addition to these mitigation strategies on public health, but also monetary and fiscal policies, industrial policies, social insurance policies. You can see the whole slew of policies that the government can get their hands on. They are all being swiftly and strongly implemented. So the one thing coming out of Chinese experience that's very positive is that 2 months after Wuhan lockdown, China is returning to normal. And that's, I think that the world can breathe a little easier and looking at these results. But these results at the same time, I will show you that it's pretty grim, right? So if we look at the current decline, that this is our survey based on our alumni and students. We do this every month since 2011. Just a little bit background, and you can see our data sort of tests very well on the in predicting the major economic turning points. And I want to just highlight the last time when the Chinese economy had a large fluctuation is in 2000, around September. And so September 2000, we see a sharp decline in our index, both in sales for the corporations, the firms that we survey. And by the way, most of the firms we survey are small and medium-sized business. So they are all in the private, mostly in the private sector. The profits also declined sharply, and the government responded with policies aimed at solving some of the problems the private sector was concerned, and particularly in improving the financing conditions that the firms faced. We see a rapid increase, and then we see these policies that are less sustainable than we anticipated. And so we see a gradually coming down economic activity, but ramping up again just before the coronavirus hits. So when the coronavirus hits, what we saw in February was a large decline. And the good thing is coming this March, this decline has reversed. And so we have a reversal, and we hope it will be a sharp V-shaped response going on. And we will be looking very carefully at the April data and then see if that pan out to be, and we anticipate that. But at the same time, I want to show you is that, which we'll summarize, is that we would expect that by March, with more firms that are resuming production, we would expect probably a little higher rebound, but we didn't see. So as a result, I am going to say that the economy is not like a switch you can turn on and turn off. You can turn the lights off, and then you decide to turn the light on, you turn it on. And the economy does not work that way, and it's more complicated. It's when you turn it on, it takes time for all the firms to adjust. I think the best analogy is that in the whole supply chain, everyone has to turn on. Everyone has to ramp up at the same rate. If one firm or some segment of the firm is not ramping up as rapidly as others, I think the whole supply chain is limited to that firm. And so what we're seeing is this rapid ramping up, but at the same time, we're not seeing a rapid rebound in economic activity from sales and profits. Now, the next thing we're looking at is what is causing all the rapid change. There are two more index we look at. One is inventory. The red line shows inventory. The inventory level has been reducing. So the improving, so basically when you see a rising index suggesting the inventory has been going down. Now during the coronavirus months, the inventory going down is partly because factories were not producing, and so the supplies are being run down and the inventory is being run down. The good thing is that inventory are now building up, and so that's a good thing. But if you build up too much, it would suggest that there are lots of uneven resumption of work in the supply chain, and that may cause the inventory in some sectors to build up even more, and that would not be very efficient. And the other reason we see the rapid increase in resumption of work has to do with the improving financing conditions in China. The Chinese government has responded to the coronaviruses very aggressively, not only in social, in public policy policies, but also in public health policies, but also in the era of fiscal, monetary, and industrial policies, and helping firms resuming production and so on and so forth, including providing needed financing to prevent firms from going under, to help firms pay the rents, to help firms pay for their employees who are paid partial wage and so on and so forth, and to also reduce taxes and for them. So we see this rapidly improving financing conditions and also increasing activities in March, which is very good. So when we combine the four indexes together, what we see is a composite index, we call it BCI, and this index actually tracks very well other economic indicators. So since we talk about components, I'm not going to spend much time on this one. We do look at other aspects of this. One of the things we do look at is how sustainable the Chinese small business and medium-sized business are going to be going forward. And here we see these labor costs and total cost indices. In general, we've seen this rapid increase in costs in China. And so I remind you that 50 means the cost is either increase or decrease. The cost remain the same. If it's above 50, this is very similar to PMI index, which is a diffusion index. So we see when we look at these numbers before that are significantly above 50, they are most of the time they're above 75, suggesting that throughout the Chinese economy, from the days we were doing this, from 2011 to today, the costs has been rising very quickly in China. And the labor cost increase is also bad and also good, right? Because rising labor costs suggesting also rising wages, which as economists, we see a positive side of that as well. Given the Chinese wage historically has been low, and then rising wage is a nice trend to have. But in general, you see the large increases in the past. But during the coronavirus months, February and March, we see the costs continuing to trending down and sharply. And this is while the economic activity is going down, we see the costs also being reduced very sharply. We hope that this trend will remain, and we're not going to see a large ramping up in the costs as the firm resume production, and that would make the resumption more sustainable. But at the same time, we also be very interested in how prices are changing. At this moment, many of our students are worried about inflation. They look at the massive monetary stimulus. They say, oh, inflation is coming. But our data, as I've been trying to tell students, at this moment, inflation is not our concern. Our concern mostly has to do with deflation. Going on forward, we might have to reassess the situation. But looking at the data you've seen what I mean. Throughout the sample period, we've seen prices rather stable, and many producer prices are falling. But during the corona months in February and March, we see a large decrease in the cost and prices. This is our factory gate prices. And so these are prices the firm charge other firms and consumers. And so this is, with the red line shows the prices that the firms charge other firms. So they are selling intermediate goods. The blue line are the consumer. So the consumer price index, we see a little reversal, but it's still below 50, which means prices are falling, and it's just falling at a lesser rate. But the most thing that concerns me is going on forward, because for the Chinese economy to grow, China needs to make more investment. Firms may need to be more confident about the future, so they will invest more, they will hire more workers. I'll remind you that since our sample is small and medium-sized businesses, they account for bulk of the Chinese employment. What we're seeing is during the coronavirus months, when these large decreases in both index, and now we see a rebound in both index, but they are still much lower than what we've seen in the past. So in the past, these small and medium-sized businesses in China has been very gung-ho, and they are very eager to invest and eager to hire, increase their labor force. And we see in 2018, there's a sharp decline and then large rebound, but this coronavirus has caused a sharp decline, which I think as the firms resume production, we hope that this will ramping up, and we're worried about the implications on the employment or unemployment as we speak. Just a reminder, in general, our firms are mostly small firms, and they are private sector firms, but since they are part of our alumni, and usually we tend to get students coming from firms that are better performing. And so when we ask them, when they compare their firm to industry average and how is their competitiveness compared, and they would respond that they are in general much stronger than the average. And so, I want to give you a view about the world, not from an average firm or a representative firm, but I want to give you a view of the world from some of the elite small and medium-sized businesses in China. And if these elite businesses are behaving the way they are, and I think we're looking at a much sharper decline than most people have anticipated. And so as China implemented very strong containment policies for public health, and we see the economy is taking a very large toll. And I think this ought to be if we have to look at what's going to happen to Italy, what's going to happen to the United States, and I think this might be something that's relevant to look at. So finally, I want to draw some lessons from China, right? So what China has shown is that social distancing containment measures work. We have no other better ways to do this, and we wish there's a vaccine, but I think vaccine is still 12 to 18 months before we could inoculate the majority of the population. So in the meantime, we hope this coronavirus would go through the world once, and not like the 1918 flu that went through the world 3 times. And if this virus goes through the world 3 times, that might we might have to reassess our current policy stance. The economic impact and from these policies, the containment policies, has been huge, and it is certainly to most people, including economists, it's worth it. And I think one of the lessons we learned is that we need to do it fast. Many times people say, well, let's react to it. But coronavirus And these contagion, these pandemics, is not something that you can wait for the data and to act on it. You have to anticipate the data, because once you wait for the data, it is already too late. And unfortunately, I think for many countries, it is already too late. And so that means the containment measure would have to be more draconian. There are broad range of policies that China have used, and many of them were very successful. Public health policies, fiscal, monetary, social insurance, industrial, financial, trade, and so on and so forth. The list is very long, and I will not go into many of the details. And if some of the audience might want to know more, then I'm happy to go through some of them. Finally, I want to say is that the resumption of production is not as easy as turning on the switch. I'm sorry, I see a spelling error there. And the reason I think I'd like to expand this idea a little bit, in the early 1990s, I did my PhD thesis on why Russia and Eastern Europe collapsed with the Big Bang policy. One of the reasons when I did my thesis was that the Big Bang in Russia and Eastern Europe in the early 1990s really created a situation where there's a large disruption in the supply chain. And what we are observing is very similar. And that Big Bang in Russia and Eastern Europe caused a production fall of 20 to 40%, and depending which country you look at. What we're looking at coronavirus is creating very sharp decline in industrial production and throughout the supply chain. And I think that's very similar. And people will say, why can't these firms negotiate with each other, resume production, keep the supply chain going? It is not as simple as that. And it is probably simpler today than it is during the Russian and the Eastern European reforms. But what we've seen in China is that it is still not as easy as turning on the switch. And this will take time. And I think policy support for firms doing it will be very important. I think one important policy is that right now, I think the government should not, or the public should not put the firm to make the firm take the risk, if there's, again, if there's a second rebound, if there's a rebound of these the virus infection, would we hold the firm responsible? If you hold the firm responsible, a lot of firms think this is too much risk, you might not take. And it's much better if we let the third party, an insurance company, to take on the risk. And then we price the risk appropriately. And I think that would be much better. And it'd be reduce significantly this uncertainty. Firms are willing to make some money and to resume production. But if you have to make them pay the cost of someone gets sick, and there will be a lot of not only monetary, but also opinion and public opinion risks the firms are taking. So anything that we can do is to not to take away the risk, but to transfer the risk to people who are best able to handle the risk, and would be a much better way to do it. And then finally, I think international policy coordination is very essential. And I think given that China has been the factory of the world, and so the resumption of production in China is very important, because China can produce more ventilators and more protective equipment, personal protective equipment. And when the rest of the world are right now in, I would say, a run for those things. And so China, it would be much better if we could cooperate and then let the capacity in China help the rest of the world. And to cope with the crisis that we're seeing, and to hopefully shorten the period of time that these sharp decline in economic activity have to take. And as I look at I went around today, I look at empty chairs and empty tables in the restaurants, and I think this is just a horrendous thing that happened. And we have to protect the small businesses and supply chain. Hopefully, we can quickly turn on the switch, and then firms would resume work. But that may not be as easy as we're seeing this. So cooperation, coordination will do a lot of work, do a lot of good work for us. Thank you. I'll pass on to Jessica.
You are still muted, Jessica.
Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Liu, and your presentation and your thoughts on the current crisis. So next, I'd like to hand the floor over to Greg, who will present the results of the March 2020 AmCham /survey. And Greg, could you also give us a little more background on the survey, who was surveyed, and what you hope to achieve?
Certainly. First of all, thank you to CKGSB for giving me the opportunity to engage with all of you. I'm very pleased to share the platform with Professor Li. We at AmCham China are avid fans of the professor's work and rely quite a bit on the survey that Professor Li and team do to reflect conditions in the Chinese SME community. So this is a nice opportunity, unfortunate circumstances, but hopefully we can support each other and learn from much of this. I hope that each of you listening today and your friends and your family are somewhere safe and remain so. I have a big pile of slides ready to share with you today, but I promise you no death by PowerPoint. What I'm going to do is simply present what I think are one or two takeaways from each slide. The slides themselves have rather dense information on them, but my understanding is that after today's discussion, we're going to provide each of these slides to you, so you will be able to drill down and get into some of that detail. To your question, Jessica, the survey is done among our member companies. Now, we have nearly 1,000 American enterprises as part of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. And from time to time, including the COVID-19 situation, we do surveys. In this case, we actually did 2 surveys. So one of them was in around the 3rd week of February, where we did our baseline survey to understand the impact of COVID-19 situation on business conditions and results. And then almost to the day, 30 days later, we did a follow-up survey such that we could compare the baseline to the newer information and see what is shifting and so forth. At the end of the slide deck, I think I have also included a few slides that are from our business climate survey. We are in the 22nd year of doing the business climate survey, which is to say, at least in my perspective, has tremendous comparative value over time to see what American business reflects as to the operating environment here in China. Now, notable in that is that the business climate survey was done before the signing of the phase 1 trade deal, and also done obviously before COVID-19 impact. So one might then say, well, gee, why would we look at that? Because hasn't COVID-19 changed everything? And the simple answer is no. There is still very good comparative value to take what people thought, in November, and then compare it with what they think today, and see, maybe some surprises about what remains consistent, but then, of course, what is conditional to COVID-19 situations. So I'll just jump right in then and start to talk about the slides in particular. So on this second slide then, we see that 68% of member companies are facing business travel disruptions, as you would expect. More than 50% are experiencing greater revenue declines, and that is, as you would expect, up from the survey done 1 month prior. And again, an increase now 39%, up from 22% last month, that say demand for products is down. None of this will be surprising to you, but the rest of the detail on the slide then is specifics about the type of business disruptions that companies are reflecting. So which of those types of disruptions are most impactful to their business? And you can see as a percent of the respondents, which ones they chose. So hopefully that data is useful for people to dig down into. And as I just call out what I think are some of the key takeaways, perhaps then you can all challenge myself and others in the Q&A session. So moving on to slide number 3 then, we see that business impact of our members on what different scenarios they envision. So in this case, what do they think is the situation if we can see improvement on April 30 and basic, return to normal operations by April 30? What do they think is their scenario? And then a second question is, what if it takes as long as August 30? And so then the detail that you see listed there is based on those two scenarios. 57% of respondents expect that they will have a certain amount of business impact based on April 30 and so forth. So you can see that reflected in the detail, and I will move then to slide number 4. So oftentimes the media and or the financial markets are extremely eager for business to predict the future right now. And full respect to both of our, our friends in the media and the financial markets. But sometimes you don't have enough data to do that. And so what this slide to me says is that companies are remaining patient and diligent to make sure they have enough data to make those projections. And so here we'll see that, some companies say it's too soon to tell. And then others do make some projections, but overarching or overriding point here is a lot of companies, in this case, what is it, upwards of, around 50% are saying that, we really need more data. So we need to take some time, see what this presents. Naturally, folks need to do reprojections, reforecasts, need to think about, cost-saving measures, cost-cutting measures, et cetera. So our member companies are being careful about how quickly they get to those judgments. Moving on then to slide number 5. So 1/4 of our respondents expect to get back to almost normal business operations by the end of April. Another 22% have already resumed normal business operations. A next 22% expect further delays through the summer. So as you can see, almost roughly equivalent segments of those respondents have different points of view about where they can go. Now, some of that perhaps is industry specific. In further slides, you're going to see where we break down some differences reflected by sector. So moving then to slide number 6, this slide is about projections for 2020 market growth. And so 58% of the respondents say that COVID-19 will cause some level of disruption to this current year's market growth. And that's up from last month, but it's up 10%, which to me was surprisingly low. And 27% say that it's too soon to tell. Now, surprisingly low, I guess, is a good thing relative to the increase from this survey to the survey a month ago. And that certainly reflects the situation that China has seen great improvement in the battle against the virus. So perhaps our companies are more optimistic then about the ability to sort of get the economy stood back up. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you what the members say about longer term views. So notable about this slide is that it's really about this year's market growth. Some more longer term things are coming up in investment plans in future slides. So on then to slide number 7 is we break out survey responses on a number of questions by industry sector. So that's resources and industrial, technology and other R&D intensive industries, the consumer sector, and the service industries. And so here you can then find that detail within those sectors by color code about what they reflect differently on these different measures. Moving on then to slide number 8 is that 40% of our companies maintain or planning to maintain their investment levels. Now that is up 17% from 30 days ago, which, to an optimist like me is great news. And I think perhaps to those joining this webinar today is maybe surprising. But, people are saying that, or recognizing, I would say, that this is a biological event. This is not a shift in, the global economics. It's not a economic-driven crisis. It's a biological crisis that, will eventually see an end, or at least a great improvement in control measures to slow down the virus and then, keep people safe and get economies back up and running. So the fact that a greater number of respondents are saying that they're staying to their investment plans, to me was very welcome news. Now, of course, there are others that are saying it's too soon to tell, and they're going to take some time before they decide what they're going to do with their planned investments. And you can see all that reflected here. On to slide number 9 then, is that tech and service sectors have some planned decreases in investment. That's what jumps out to me on this. A fourth of tech companies say that, and nearly 1/3 in services sectors say that they will perhaps decrease investment levels. So on slide number 10, some optimism breaks through the fog for further reform, which to me makes very good sense. And I will be pleased if you push me in the Q&A to explain why I have that point of view. But our member companies say they think that additional reform can come out of this. So again, I'll hold my views and maybe you'll be curious to understand more about that later. On to slide number 11 is that this slide speaks to resumption of work and resumption of productivity measures and what our companies share with us about those things. So as of March, nearly 1/4 of respondents say that 100% of their staff continue to work from home. Clearly, that's going to be different across different sectors. So if you're in manufacturing, that's not available. But if you're in the service sector, or there's other executive or office-bound work, that most of our companies are erring on the side of human health and safety, people first, protecting the workforce as best they can, and then going from there. Now, 35% report over half of their employees have returned to the office. Now, some of that is based on compliance with measures expected by local governments and or office facility management where social distancing is reinforced. And so you can only have employees within X number of meters from one another. And so perhaps you can't fit 100% of the workforce into normal operations. And so some people, based on either project measures or on alternating days, they would then have, different people come into the office. Again, that's, driven by some particular circumstances, and the detail is here. On slide number 12 then, we see that while 58% of respondents are prioritizing, staff safety over business performance, we also see an increased emphasis on financial conditions. 48% are revising annual budgets, and that's up slightly, 7% from last month. So I guess that reflects an early start to doing this sort of reforecasting. And 40% are cutting costs and looking at cutting costs, also up 7%. I don't think this is surprising. I think it's responsible activity among business. And then people are just looking at what they might need to do to tighten their belts to get through this near-term crisis and survive into the mid and long term. So down onto slide number 13, half of respondents say it's too soon to tell what sort of impact that they can expect for the longer term, which is the 3 to 5 year window of projection. So China business strategy, 1/3 say that there will be no impact, which I would say is good that people are that optimistic. And there's a significant amount of people that really have few or no plans for changes to their 3 to 5 year projections. And we will get into some more of that moving on. So on to slide number 14 then. The tech, R&D intensive sector, and then the services sectors expect the global pandemic to have stronger impact. Resources and industrial are still unsure, and the consumer sector says, some but lesser impact. So what this slide does is to say, on the last survey, we had a China epidemic. And now on the second survey, we have a global pandemic. So considering the global pandemic, what then is your response to that similar question? And so that's what we can learn from this slide as broken out with this detail. Slide number 15 then speaks to what our members want to see from US government. And so with that, what companies are looking for is to receive commercial support, advice on business opportunities, support understanding COVID-19 related business policies, and guidance on what all of this situation might do to the phase 1 trade deal and its implementation. The next slide shows us what our member companies are hoping for from the China government. So respondents continue to seek actions from the China government regarding tax alleviation and clear, consistent policies. As China was first in this crisis, there was a large number of emergency measures that were put in place to keep people safe, and then also to put the economy, back in a position to restart. And as we know, the level of severity of the situation was different in different parts of the country. And so regional policies differed from place to place, which was a challenge, of course, for member companies because many of them are national in scope. and then they would have to deal with a different policy in different places, and they not only different policies but different interpretations of policies and how to implement them back to from one place to another, which is to say that there was great challenges in resumption of work and resumption of productivity. So we have, as a chamber, been working shoulder to shoulder with both governments, certainly with China government in particular, and worked extremely closely to help our member companies get through those challenges. And of course, we're sharing that experience then with people overseas, again, perhaps so that business overseas can also have very effective communication with their country origin governments to keep people safe and get back to work. On the following slide then, number 17, is that 87% have provided some form of assistance to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. And by some form of assistance, I think this mostly reflects early on, before the crisis went global, American companies stepped up to help China in her time of need. Our member companies, and this is really a small number of companies that were surveyed, because with nearly 1,000 companies, I think we had slightly less than 10% respond to this question and say, have they donated funds or goods like personal protective equipment, or provided services free of charge, like logistics services to ship PPE over to China, et cetera. But our member companies responded resoundingly, and so 87% of them really came to support our society here. And the last number I saw was we had contributed more than 500 million renminbi in these types of support services. Now, naturally, there's lots of support going the other way. China supporting countries outside of China now that they're in crisis and such. So again, this just speaks to me as to how we all need to come together and cooperate, to the professor's point about now that it's a global pandemic, how we all need to, get together in this global village and, fight this. So moving on then to slide number 18 is that the overall proportion of respondents reporting an expected decline in 2019 revenues increased by 14%. Now, I think here we're into the business climate survey as opposed to the COVID survey. And so that's compared with the prior year. More than half of respondents who label their primary production model as importing goods or services into China expected higher revenues in 2019 compared with 2018. So again, just a few months ago, before COVID-19 impact, this is what American business were reflecting. And so now when we take the COVID-19 data, we see, of course, that people are moderating expectations for this particular calendar year, while I'll suggest they still maintain reasonably optimistic vision for the mid and longer term. I'm going to move then to the following slide, number 19, which is to say that members report the lowest levels of profitability. So profitability has dropped in our last calendar year survey lowest since we began asking this question 18 years ago. This year, 61% of members described their 2019 financial performance as profitable or very profitable, and that's a 12% drop from the previous year. Previously, the lowest proportion of members reporting profitability was 64%, and that was recorded in both the years 2005 and 2015. While more than half of COVID-19 impact survey respondents say it's too soon to determine the estimated cost of delays in reopening business, there's about 10% that report losing at least 500,000 renminbi per day. Now, 10% is not, a high percentage, but those are, significant. And again, if you think about when the crisis may avert, so is it the end of April or the end of August, et cetera, it's a window into the future for, what other companies are going to experience if in fact the crisis is sustained. So moving on then to the slide number 20 is we're very cautious, and this reflects that our member companies are very cautious about geopolitical uncertainties. And in this case, black swan events. Now, this is from the Business Climate Survey. So, at the end of November, unfortunately, we had a black swan event with COVID-19. And so 40% of respondents then from the COVID-19 impact survey are revising annual budgets and 33% cutting costs. 44% say that uncertainty around the epidemic has negatively impacted their outlook regarding the bilateral relationship, while over 1/3 maintain optimism toward the regulatory environment. Let me take a moment on those last 2 points. American member business sentiment tracks very closely with how the U.S.-China broad relationship is at any given point in time. We naturally saw lots of flux because of the trade situation over the last 24, 25 months. And we also then see that, to my view, somewhat surprising that people remain optimistic about the regulatory environment, which is to China's credit, that there have been, improvements over time about the regulatory environment on the ground. But the previous point is that we all remain concerned because things can get upended when the broader U.S.-China relationship doesn't work as well. Now, we maintain that the commercial relationship is in fact the foundation of the bilateral relationship. So everything we can do to improve the commercial relationship then accrues to helping the broader relationship maybe get back to a better place that is good then for the people of both of our countries, and of course good for the global welfare, because we're the 2 largest economies in the world and we need to work together. So moving then on to slide number 21. 24% of our members anticipate negative or flat industry market growth in 2020. Naturally, we need to think now this is somewhat outdated. But 1 in 4 companies, over 40%, especially in the R&I, the resources and industrial sector, do not expect their markets to grow in 2020. Half of service sector respondents see great opportunity stemming from globalization of Chinese companies and increased outbound investment. Now, again, we'll take a short-term hit with COVID to that, but I think longer term that information is still valid. The resources and industrial sector emphasize that urbanization and continued support for infrastructure investments are areas for growth. Consumer sector says increasing customer demand for foreign brands and quality are an important opportunity. Now, I'll take the moment to say that this is very different, the economy, and the professor would be well placed to speak to this later if he chooses. After SARS in 2003, we saw a wonderful, bounce and some change and an innovation in the economy. But the economy back then was much more reliant on export-oriented manufacturing and also on infrastructure investment. Now, there's a greater than 20% difference in today's economy as consumer activity measured as a contribution to overall GDP. And so the chance for a hockey stick bounce based on once the consumer activity can resume in a robust way, we may see a very robust bounce, and that's why our consumer sector should be looking forward to new opportunity. Think about, after 2003, the innovation that happened, which really, had explosive opportunity for companies like Alibaba and Jingdong and others. And so we, any Chinese enterprise or American enterprise, we should be looking then for what is that new opportunity that's going to come out of COVID-19 recovery. So moving then on to the 22nd slide is our member companies. This slide then breaks out what the different sectors list as their top priority of concern. So I realize there's a lot of data here, but I'm going to suggest this is a great slide for people to understand these sectors and how they react differently. For instance, increasing Chinese protectionism or regulatory compliance risks are top challenges for the technology sector. But you'll see something different in consumer and services, which place that a bit lower on their list. Industry overcapacity and the US tariffs on Chinese goods are having a very big impact on the resources and industrial sector. So that's what this slide tells us, and you can dig into that detail. Now, the very last slide that I have for everyone is what we have done to identify AmCham China's top recommendations for businesses in America. So tonight I'm on another webinar where we're going to present best practices to our community. And actually we opened it up, so there's a lot of people that are outside of the member community that are going to join us. But we basically focus on how to protect the workforce first and foremost, and then how to get used to this new normal that we face in this situation, identify and mitigate risks, and so to take our experience here in China and share that with people, hopefully to shorten the pain points that they have and get them more quickly back to safe workforce and resumption of productivity and such. And then how to engage the community, which includes of course government, but all the other various entities that we can embrace to pull together and get past this. So those are my slides. I would like to turn it back to you, Jessica, and look forward to engaging with Professor Li and the community online. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was very insightful and quite optimistic for all of us to hear. Well, next I'd like to go into the dialogue between you and Dr. Li. During this dialogue, I will ask some of the questions that our participants have sent in when they registered for this webinar. And if we have extra time, we will get to some of the additional questions that I have seen in the Q&A box. So to start off, I think it's safe to say that we are in recession. What impact will COVID-19 have on the Chinese GDP target of 6%? This is directed at Professor Li Wei. And what can we expect to see in the job market, the real estate market in the second half of the year?
Well, thank you. Jessica, you asked a very good question. I think people are really concerned about whether China is going to be able to meet the goal of achieving comfortable living standards, 小康社会. So that 6% would be required to achieve that goal. Actually, slightly lower than that would be required. But I think the COVID-19, if anything, has taught us one lesson. I think the lesson is human life is more important. Enjoyment of life is more important. And I think one ought to look at these and to realize that perhaps we should focus more on the quality of growth rather than growth per se. I think by focusing on quality of growth, maybe even if we don't grow the economy, but if the components of the GDP can shift, meaning that if we can have less investment, more consumption, and I think people will not feel that their lives has been down. They will feel their life has been improved because consumption is up. And I think China, I think, is right at that stage, and I think it's very important for the majority of the Chinese people to begin to enjoy the fruit of economic development. And I think rather than focusing very sharply on reaching certain economic targets, perhaps we can soften that down and then focusing on what's really important. What's really important is that people are not unemployed, and people have jobs, have gainful employment, and it's not they have jobs they like. And I think that's very, very important, and they enjoy their life. I think going on forward in China, we can assume China has already reached a comfortable living standard average, but we need to ensure the bottom doesn't fall. And I think the migrant workers are getting better jobs in the future. And I think those, to me, is most important than if we reach certain goal, like surpassing the US and so on and so forth. And that doesn't seem to be that important relative to how the average person is going to feel when they look at the end of every day. Are they enjoying their life? And so increased consumption, to me, I think is much more important. I think Greg also mentioned that many of their American businesses, invested businesses are also looking into that area. And I think many of our SME alumni are also realizing the quality of life now matters more. And I think that's an overwhelming message. And I think one of the reasons why I say so is because after the earthquake in Sichuan, I went to Sichuan and talked to people who are survivors of the earthquake. And they all displayed a much more relaxed attitude. He says, why making so much more money? Why not enjoying life more? Because life is so precious once you see the downside of that. And I think that's one of the, hopefully, I think that's one of the messages we're going to get. But at the same time, I think economic development over the long term is still very important. And then, one way to look at these large pandemic is to compare with a tsunami. But the difference is that tsunami destroys physical structure, destroys capital. This coronavirus is invisible. It's basically sort of shortens people's life. And that's really something that I think very relevant for today's economy, because today's economy is more about human capital, less about physical capital. And that human capital is very important. And we see, World War II, right? The World War II, both Germany and Japan were defeated. Their physical structure, infrastructure is all destroyed. But these two countries recovered very quickly. And it's because of human capital has been preserved. I think preserving human capital is much better than preserving, I'm not saying the physical capital is not important, but it's, if given the choice, I would do human capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Li Wei. That's very philosophical of you and optimistic. So I think today it was reported that in the US, 3.3 million people have applied for unemployment. And we are hopefully going to see one of the biggest stimulus bills ever passed in this country, in the US. And I'm sure China is doing also something very similar. So what sort of things can government do to preserve the enjoyment of life and for everyone, those who have and have not?
Right. So one of the things I think very important is to have this social distancing, and that's going to destroy lots of jobs temporarily. So if we could, think about this, if we could freeze people just for 2 months, that they don't have any contact with each other, and this virus would just die. But how can we do that without permanently damaging our economy? And one way to do it is to provide people with while they are working at home, while they are not working, to make sure that the basic infrastructure of the sustained life is still operating, right? We don't turn off our water, our electricity still runs, and so on and so forth. Delivery of goods still arrive at the door, and so on and so forth. And if I call restaurant for a takeout, that's still available. And we will do more of that and to sustain the economy. And if we could do that, then that would suggest that somehow the public policy can play a much bigger role. Part of the reason is that if you look at US, the $2 trillion stimulus package, it sounds very large, right? It's large. It's by far the largest. It's just the scale is unfathomable, right? But it's roughly 5 weeks of US GDP. And so if you think about that, if we could freeze the US economy for 5 weeks, and by providing that stimulus package, you provide the buffer for that, and that would do a lot of good to encourage people to do the social distancing and to make sure the medical supply and the hospitals are well staffed and so on and so forth. Make sure we, as one of the best thing to do right now is to flatten the curve. And we do social distancing, we do lockdown. The idea was to flatten the curve, but all these flatten the curve is going to drive the economy deeper into recession. So at this moment, if we could provide this support and to lessen that crash. And the reason we want to lessen the crash is because as the economy crashes, people still have rents to pay, businesses still have interest payments to make. So we don't want people to declare bankruptcy. We don't want firms to go bankrupt. And because once you are under, it is much harder to resuscitate, to have them revived, right? The firms are gone, and we know the bankruptcy cost is very high. And if we could let them go bankrupt, the next day they come back online, that's ideal world. We're not in that world. So ideal thing is to have most businesses, viable businesses, have them preserved, maybe frozen, and then
if I may,
later on. Right.
If I may, I'd like to build slightly on Professor Lee's points and also combine somewhat the two questions together. One as to the effect of this stimulus package, and also then what it might do to the labor force. And so as Professor Lee points out, it's a massive amount of money, but in overall terms, it really isn't going to last that long, given the need and the size of the US economy. That brings me back to the point that really cash flow is king. So $2 trillion is just so much money that it's hard to imagine, but where does it go? And I read a great article, in this case from the New York Times, maybe 2 days ago. And it also spoke to this point and said that basically, if you use this money to support small and medium-sized enterprises so that they can meet their payroll and their rent and their tax payments and such, well, this money's gone really soon. So it's not actually stimulating the economy going forward. It's just keeping business alive. And so that brings me to the point of labor. And so if you use the example of China, which the professor also spoke to, is that people want to have a modestly prosperous society and such. But the China Communist Party also absolutely has to have people gainfully employed. That's part of social stability and being able to keep society safe and moving forward, etc. Now, we really wanted to touch on this because what people overseas in the US are thinking about, and cost saving, cost cutting, etc., is different than it is in China. In China, cash flow is king because companies need to survive. But Chinese labor law is actually very, very protective of the individual, not of the business. But that doesn't matter if your business is no longer viable. if you go out of business, everybody loses their job. But it's not a employment at will type scenario for most companies, because, and that's how it is in China or in the US. In the US, you can cut the workforce. In China, if you cut the workforce, there's very, very large costs to doing so. So it may actually not be advantageous to cost. You may be increasing your costs in doing that. So those are very different scenarios in these two places. I just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, the other thing I want to mention is that the reason you want to have the fiscal and monetary policy as a support is that you don't want to create a situation where this coronavirus problem becomes a systemic risk. Right? It is already a systemic risk. You don't want, it's a systemic risk on the society. You don't want to turn into a systemic risk on the economy, to having firms declare bankrupt, having their debt become bad debt on the banks, and having banks declare bankruptcy, and then the whole thing blow up. Right? So you want to provide the necessary support so that the economy can come back strongly once the virus risk is over. And I think it will be over. Yeah, Jessica?
Yeah, so I have a question from a participant that I'd like to ask. Let me just pull that up. The question is directed at both of you, but first the question, this is specific to Greg. What are your views on the U.S.-China relationship? Is this an acceleration of the decoupling between the U.S. and China? I know you said earlier you were quite optimistic. You know, could you elaborate a little bit on your thoughts on that? And sort of the confidence from the American companies, their confidence in operating in China in the future, especially companies who are looking to invest into China. And for Dr. Li Wei, the question is that how can we see the survival rate for domestic SMEs, given most of them are either relying on providing goods or services to MNCs or export? China may seem to be in a remission, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs banned the entry of the international travelers yesterday, suggesting the risk still remains high. So will this pandemic fundamentally change the supply chain and put already vulnerable Chinese companies at jeopardy?
Who would you like us, which of us would you like to start, Jessica, please?
Greg, why don't you start first?
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. So as to the bilateral relationship, it's not good. It hasn't been good for some time. And we, the world, need it to get better. The US and China need to work in a better way with more nuanced, direct diplomacy, certainly because of the COVID-19 global pandemic, but also because of every other important world issue that relies on, you know, these two largest economies in the world to be able to work together in a diplomatic and, you know, professional way, as opposed to a lot of what we've, you know, experienced recently, which is tons of nasty rhetoric and other things that are not productive and not useful and are indeed a threat to you know, global welfare, both to health and economic well-being, et cetera. So again, we have a wonderful foundation for US-China exchange. Part of that is commercial. And we have, you know, as I suggested, that's the base for the overall relationship. But we, you know, it's cultural, it's academic, it's, the peoples of our countries like each other and share a lot of values. Our systems of government are very different, and that causes a lot of tension and clashes. But I would reach back to my predecessor, and a statement he used that I really like is that we have to get to a place of 和而不同. So we're different, but we need to find our way through those differences and work through them. So as to some optimism, perhaps, that I referred to earlier is optimism for the prospect of continued reform. And so China, as you know, opening and reform has been going on for, a long time now, 30 plus years, and made lots of progress. Of course, we wish it would make more and sooner. But if you look to, for instance, there are probably 60 measures of economic reform that were passed in 2013 when this new administration came into power just a few months before, but they really haven't been implemented in a robust way. So there's a lot of things that are already on the books that China subscribes to and are waiting. Now, I would suggest the reason for optimism is that China can, in her own self-interest, act to drive those reforms more and more quickly, because it will be to the benefit of the Chinese economy and therefore to the benefit of the Chinese people. And it doesn't really have anything to do with the bilateral relationship. It's not because the Americans are making noise. It's because China needs to do this to reach that level of a moderately prosperous society. So I suggest that that's because of the self-interest involved. That's a good reason for optimism. I think there was a third element and I'm not remembering it, so I'm going to pass back to Professor Lee.
I'm sorry, I think you said it very well. And I look at your survey, I realize that business people are different. They are selected. They're self-selected to be optimists. Otherwise, why would they do business? Right. So it is very important. Our students are also very optimistic about a lot of things that average person might not be as optimistic. And I think there are positive aspects to that. And I have to say that both China and the United States benefit greatly from the relations that we have enjoyed in the past 40 years. And I think that cultural and economic exchange will continue, and it will, and hopefully that it will deepen in many areas in cooperation in the future because of the COVID-19 crisis. And I think people realize that cooperation is much more important. We all thought the other is our enemy, and now we realize the enemy is someone else. That's called new coronavirus, right? So that's something that really can bring people together. And I think if we realize that this is not a virus, affecting one country, it is a global virus. It is a global pandemic. And so that's something that will help us sort of get together and how to figure out a way to overcome it. And the other thing I think Jessica mentioned about is this decoupling. And I think that's an area that I've been putting a lot of thought on this. Part of the reason is because I think in general, and I think that term sounds 0-1, and I think the real world is much grayer. The real world is much more colorful in terms of how these new global supply chain is going to be configured. I think the COVID-19, if it taught us anything, it taught us that having the supply chain to be concentrated in any place is not a good idea, geographic location. It is in the new configuration of the global supply chain. I think we have to rationalize this by saying that perhaps we can move into a model like electricity supply, where there is a base load that demand is being met by a very large and efficient power plant. And then there are the peak loads that we don't want to build these large plants that cannot easily be shut down. That we use these more flexible plants and to do it. And hopefully these flexible plants are built closer to the user. And so these are the things that maybe global supply chain got to be configured in a way that a lot of critical components, critical goods are going to have a bimodal production mode where you have the base load are still located where the least cost places, but there are flexible production distributed around the world in case the base load, the base production capacity gets somehow get into trouble, whether it's a tsunami or earthquake or coronavirus or something else, but that flexible production capacity can come online that prevents these large shocks that reverberates across the economy. And I think it's beneficial to everyone in the world, and it's not just the United States, not just to China or Europe. It's to the benefit of everyone. That if we can figure out a way to alleviate these bottlenecks, to reduce the risk of a systematic shutdown, and I think that would be very useful. So I wouldn't count the globalization to die, but I think we might need a new globalization. Greg?
Jessica, the professor reminds me of that third element that slipped my mind, and that is the question you raised about decoupling. And I'll put that again in the category of the kind of things that journalists and financial markets are really eager to talk about, and they're really eager to lay it on the issue of the day. And so previously it was the trade dispute, and now it's COVID-19, and everybody wants a determination that yes, this is going to cause this. But business people are also pragmatic, and if you think about coupling or decoupling, it's just a matter of cost. And so is there cost advantage in doing it in coupling or in decoupling? Now, of course, you have to have risk mitigation as well. So maybe in some instances you accept slightly higher costs to lower your risk. That's certainly the case. But I think the idea of decoupling is overdone and over dramatized because the level of tension in the US-China relationship. So everybody says, oh, the relationship's so bad, therefore everybody's going to decouple. Well, frankly, if this the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic ends tomorrow, you're going to find what is basic human nature, which is inertia. People are going to say, okay, everything's back up and running. I can delay this decision about it. And, to the professor's point, from 2011, we've seen labor costs, which are very significant to, why China became a global center for production and export. Labor costs have been rising. And so actually shifting of supply chains has been happening for a very long time. Then when, the trade dispute came about, it was because of tariffs. But tariffs, again, were then reduced and maybe have a prospect in the sometime future of going away. So again, when those happen, people are going to say, oh, my costs are now lower. What is my now sense of urgency for coupling or decoupling? So again, I think we just have to step back and take a breather. But the last point I'll make is that our member companies do not reflect that the trade dispute, and they do not reflect that COVID-19 is going to drive them all offshore. It's just not that simple. It's not that easy. And the data doesn't support it. When the data does support it, we'll say it.
It's such an interesting world where, Craig, you are in China and I am in the United States.
Yes.
Thank you both. Well, that leads me on to my next question is, how will the coronavirus affect investors and startup founders who are looking for capital in the short and long term? And how do you think the direction of foreign investment will flow? Outbound and inbound, what are your opinions on that?
Is this for me then, Jessica?
Correct. Please go ahead.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of conditions, and the professor will be better placed to speak to these than I, but there are a lot of conditions really where foreign investment is looking to China as a good opportunity right now. One example I'll give is the China bond market and corporate bonds and others, which are presenting some reasonably good returns at the moment. So business people are going to place their capital where they expect a decent return, and so far the data suggests that they're still looking. If I look to our business climate survey from the end of last year, China remains a top 3 investment destination. And if you take that with the optimism that people have about the prospects of further economic reform measures, unless something goes completely off the rails, and unless we still have this, I would say, unnecessary tension in the bilateral relationship, things should be accrue to continued foreign direct investment in China.
From your survey, that you're already seeing how optimistic business people are, and they are optimistic about the Chinese market, the global market. So they are continuing going to be making investments wherever they find business opportunities, and the Chinese economy will likely grow at a much faster rate than the rest of the world in the coming decade. So it remains a very attractive market, especially when Chinese market shifting from investment-centric Chinese economy, moving from investment-centric to consumption-centric. And I think that shift has been occurring in the last decade or so. And I think we hope that with COVID-19, this is going to accelerate even more after this, hopefully.
Thank you both. I think we're running low on time, so I'm just going to ask one last question, and that is, what are the new opportunities to come out of COVID-19? Which sectors do you expect to see a rebound in China?
Let me take on that very quickly. I'll mention, first of all, medical equipment and medicine, and those are going to be the ones that can benefit a lot, and we need those investments in there. And because if COVID-19 told us anything, is that building those public health and basic health facility capability is very important to meet the future calamities like this. And also that even if that we don't have these crisis pandemics very often, still having more higher quality services in the health area would still benefit the Chinese population greatly. And so we expect that there are going to be more investment in those areas in China and also around the world. I think investment in new medicine, in tackling future viruses, that is going to be very important. We've been very good with antibiotics, with killing bacteria, but with virus, and I think the last time that it galvanized the industry to make huge investment was with HIV/AIDS disease, but then now with COVID-19, and I hope that there would be more focus on virus research and the treatment, and then of course that means that we're going to make less investments, and we're dealing with an older population, and with all those chronic diseases, but having more spending on acute diseases will be also very important. And then of course after all this, right, in the end, and I think we're going to see a rapid rebound in probably the other services sector. So I'm sure that Greg has more to add on this. I'll pass the mic to Greg.
Thank you, Professor. I certainly agree. The service sector has tremendous opportunity for expansion. of course, is a great strength of the American business environment to provide these services, and then in providing them, that would strengthen the Chinese economy and benefit the Chinese people. But I'm going to broaden it to say that these areas of opportunity could be much, much wider if indeed China drives forward faster with economic liberalization. So the question is almost somewhat limiting to our current circumstance. And I would like to broaden the opportunities and the possibilities by saying, if China took those 60 reform measures that they already put into law in 2013 and they implemented them, well, then there would be just, tons of opportunity in every sector, and our moderately prosperous society would arrive much sooner.
Great. Thank you both. I think that's a topic for our next webinar. But I want to conclude by thanking both Professor Li Wei and Greg Gilligan, our partners, the American Chamber of Commerce, the Australian Chamber of Commerce, the British Chamber of Commerce, and the Swiss Chamber of Commerce in China, and our viewers for joining this webinar. Please follow us at Hong Kong Graduate School of Business on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram for more updates on webinars, insights, and news. We'd love to know more about your interest in China business and its economy, so we can provide better suited content for you in the future. So please take a minute to fill out our short survey linked in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We will be emailing the recording of this webinar, as well as Professor Li Wei's BCI March data and analysis, and Greg Gilligan's AmCham flash survey for March 2020. Thank you very much for joining, and I hope you all stay safe.
Thank you.